Hello, this is Chef John from foodwishes.com with pepperoni pigs in a blanket. That's right, before we wrap them in pastry, we're going to wrap our cocktail franks in pepperoni, which not only makes these pigs in a blanket more delicious and better looking, since we're wrapping them twice, it also technically makes these pigs in a blanket in a blanket. And to get started, we will take a tube of ready-to-bake crescent dough from the store. You know, that one brand every single grocery store carries. And we will separate those perforated triangles of dough and lay them out on a parchment-lined sheet pan. Since before we work with it, I like to pop it in the freezer for about 10 or 15 minutes, so it's nice and cold and firm when we use it. And while that's chilling, let me show you the other two main ingredients. Okay, we're going to need some nice spicy pepperoni, as well as a whole bunch of cocktail franks. And no, yours don't have to be horribly disfigured. I know these do look disturbing, but here's why. Alright, apparently they shrink wrap these under such pressure, they all got disfigured when they were crushed together. But the good news is, despite the bizarre appearance, these did work very well. And as long as the size and shape is right to be able to wrap a piece of pepperoni around them, whatever you use is going to work. And then once our crescent dough is very firm and nice and cold, we will take one of the triangles, and then using a pizza wheel or a knife, we will cut 3 strips, about 1 inch wide. And yes, we'll definitely save that little leftover piece, since for this operation at least, we can definitely press some smaller pieces together in case we need more dough to wrap our little dogs. And then once we have some fairly even strips cut, we'll cut those into about 2.5 inch lengths. And since 1 tube of crescent dough contains 8 of these triangles, and we are trying to make 48 of these pigs in a blanket altogether, that means we want to get at least 6 wrappable pieces per triangle. And to show you that's definitely possible, I got enough for 7 out of this one. But anyway, once we have our little strips of dough formed, we will wrap 1 cocktail frank with 1 piece of pepperoni, and then we'll center it on our dough and roll it up. And there's really no secret tips or techniques to pass along here. Okay, we're just simply rolling these up. And as usual, if at all possible, we will try to end up with a seam at the bottom. And if you've never done these before, it is not going to seem like this is enough dough. But trust me, it is. And in my opinion, the perfect amount of dough. Right, other folks will tell you, since this is called pigs in a blanket, that our dough should cover almost the entire cocktail frank, and that the method I'm using here really isn't pigs in a blanket. It's more like pigs in a tube top, which, by the way, might even be a cooler name. But anyway, I'm not into full coverage, so you're going to have to make the call. I mean, you are, after all, the Banksy of how much dough these franks see. But once these bake up to a beautiful golden brown, I think you'll agree we use the perfect amount. And then once we do have our pigs in a blanket, we will transfer those onto a parchment-lined baking sheet. And if we space these carefully, we'll be able to fit 48. And we'll do that by laying these out 6 by 8. And once we have those all placed on, again, ideally with the seam side down, I like to brush the tops of the dough with some melted butter, which is going to help these brown up even more beautifully. And yes, of course, we could do the same thing with an egg wash, but we only need a little bit, so let's not waste the rest of the egg. And besides, I think the butter is going to help make the tops a little crisper. And then speaking of the tops, once those have been brushed, I'm going to sprinkle these with some sesame seeds, which of course is going to add a little bit of flavor. But what it's also, and more importantly, going to do is provide some visual contrast between those light seeds and that darker golden brown pastry, which, as you'll see, is really going to make the appearance pop. So no, you don't need to seed, but I kind of hope you do. And that's it. Once those have been applied, these are now ready to pop into the center of a 425-degree oven for about 20 to 25 minutes, or until they're beautifully browned and look like this. Oh yeah, now those are some adorable pigs in a blanket. And if everything goes according to plan, the bottom should be nice and crisp and beautifully browned as well. And then we really should let these cool down a little bit before we enjoy them, except I'm not going to. They just looked and smelled too good. So I'm going to enjoy a couple now, piping hot, which even without any kind of dipping sauce were amazing. Right, even a regular cocktail frank wrapped in pastry is a wonderful thing to eat. But when we add in that extra element of that pepperoni, which is adding extra fat and flavor, but also texturally speaking, the edges have gotten a little bit crispy, which is elevating the experience even more. So I really did thoroughly enjoy these as is. But for a party, what we're really going to want to do is plate these up next to a nice mustard sauce, which is just half mayonnaise, half mustard, that I top with a little bit of chive, plus a couple shakes of cayenne, because I guess we use pepperoni. I don't know, I just wanted to put some on. And that's it. Now that we have a sauce, we can enjoy these as the food gods intended. And these, my friends, are an iconic party snack for a reason. Right? These might be small, but they're very powerful, especially with that addition of pepperoni. Oh, and by the way, if we have any kids watching, if you are going to double dip, let me show you the proper way. Once you've taken a bite, you're going to want to turn your pigs in a blanket around, so you can dip the unbitten tip into the dip, which I think makes it totally fine to do. Although please check with your parents to make sure. And as I covered earlier, if you want to put more pastry on these, go ahead. But for me, these have the absolute perfect ratio. Right, there's plenty to grab without having to touch the pepperoni or the wiener. Although I should warn you about one thing. If your pastry is not so much of a blanket as it is a ring, you may experience what we call in the business a total wiener dislocation. But if that happens, just relax. Just regrip and complete the dip. But anyway, other than that, there's really not much that can go wrong. Oh, and if you're not into the pepperoni, don't use it. This method will work exactly the same without it. But whether you leave the pepperoni off or make these exactly as shown, these are never not a huge hit at a party, which is why I really do hope you give these a try soon. So please follow the links below for the ingredient amounts, a printable written recipe, and much more info as usual. And as always, enjoy.